Everyone knows the deal. In 1867, Uncle Sam picked up Alaska for $7.2 million. To put that in perspective, that is basically the price of a budget burger combo for every 250 acres of land. It was the ultimate real estate steal. But here is what the history books usually skip. The expedition to actually find and map that frozen frontier cost the Russian Empire nearly 20% of its entire annual revenue and ate up over a decade of human life. Back in 1720, while European powers were busy locking down trade routes in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the border between Alaska and Siberia was a ghost on the map. It was the final boss of the Age of Discovery. At the time, nobody actually knew if humanity lived on one continuous giant island or isolated landmasses. If North America turned out to be just an extension of Asia, the New World lost its exclusive gated community status. It meant you could, theoretically, hike all the way from Moscow to what is now Canada without ever getting your boots wet. On December 29th, 1724, Tsar Peter the Great handpicked a Danish explorer named Vitus Bering for the job. Now, a Dane leading a Russian operation might sound like a bureaucratic glitch, but the Tsar didn't care about the flag on Bering's birth certificate. He wanted a resume that could deliver results, and Bering had the goods. Peter's orders were simple but borderline suicidal. Head over to Kamchatka, build a ship or two from scratch, sail north, and find out if Russia was accidentally neighbours with America. Oh, and while you're at it, find some European settlements and grill any foreign captains you run into for intel. Bering wasn't the only guy on the shortlist, but he was a seasoned veteran who knew the Indian Ocean and the east coast of North America like the back of his hand. He was a logistical mastermind who actually knew how to talk to people without starting a mutiny. To back him up, he had Martin Spanberg, another tough-as-nails Dane, and Alexei Chirikov, a highly educated Russian officer who had all the book smarts but none of the salt on his boots. But here is the kicker. Unlike European expeditions that sailed out of high-end ports with fully stocked galleons, Bering's mission started with absolutely nothing. No port and no ships, and effectively, no square inch of a starting line. He didn't just have to find the frontier, he had to build the tools to get there first. In January 1725, Vitus Bering marched out of St. Petersburg with a ragtag crew of officers, craftsmen, and soldiers. To call this a challenge is an understatement. It was a logistical nightmare that would make a modern supply chain manager have a stroke. Before a single plank could touch the water, the expedition had to haul 6,000 miles of gear across the wilderness. We are talking about everything from the smallest nail to massive ship anchors. They were dragging iron, canvas, rigging, and supplies for 2 full-sized vessels across a landscape with 0 roads, 0 infrastructure, and maps that were basically just guesswork. They had to hump all that dead weight across the continent just to reach the Pacific coast before they could even start thinking about sailing. It was 2 years of brutal, soul-crushing labour. The expedition marched out of St. Petersburg. What followed was a 1,000-mile grind through some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. Using horse-drawn sleds, the team reached Vologda in just 8 days, but the real nightmare began when they hit the Ural Mountains. By March 16th, after covering roughly 1,750 miles, they rolled into Tobolsk. This was where the expedition faced its first massive logistical jump. As the administrative capital of the Siberian province, Tobolsk was the last civilized supply hub before they disappeared into the deep wilderness. Bering was a strategist. He knew that building ships in the middle of nowhere required more than just luck. He requisitioned a massive boost in manpower, drafting local carpenters, blacksmiths, and soldiers from the garrison. He wasn't just looking for muscle, he was building a mobile construction battalion to protect and haul his gear into the void. The journey east from Tobolsk marked a brutal pivot from sleds to river navigation. On May 14th, 1725, the expanded expedition pushed off along the Irtysh River. Bering's strategy was tactical. He split the crew into smaller strike teams to navigate the swamps and dense forests where roads were a myth. The winter of 1725 was spent in the Ilimsk and Ust-Kut regions, where the mission transformed from a march into a full-scale industrial operation. In the middle of nowhere, Spanberg's team had to supervise the construction of a makeshift river fleet, prepping to sail the Lena River the second the ice thawed. What they did in Ust-Kut was a Herculean feat of engineering. They built 15 barges, each about 45 feet long, and 14 smaller boats to haul tons of iron and supplies. This winter standoff allowed them to stockpile food, but it absolutely shredded the men. They were doing heavy industrial labour in temperatures that routinely plummeted to -40 degrees. At that point, Fahrenheit and Celsius actually meet. It doesn't matter which scale you use. It is simply the kind of cold that turns human effort into a nightmare of imperial proportions. When the spring thaw finally hit in 1726, the expedition tore down the Lena River, reaching Yakutsk by mid-June. Yakutsk was the commercial hub of eastern Siberia, but it was nowhere near ready for a crew this large or this demanding. This is where Bering hit his first major non-natural wall: pure, unadulterated, bureaucratic inertia. Resources in Yakutsk weren't just low, they were non-existent. Bering needed hundreds of horses and tons of flour for the final, most brutal leg to Okhotsk. The local governor, however, was dragging his feet. Bering eventually had to drop the nice guy act and resort to formal imperial threats just to get the man to do his job. To prevent a total collapse from starvation, Bering made a high-stakes tactical call to split his forces into 4 distinct units. The heavy haulers Spanberg's unit, 209 men carrying the heavy metal, anchors and cannons. They took the river route, betting on the water to carry the weight. The advance team Kozlov's unit, a specialised squad of shipwrights sent ahead to Okhotsk to prep the shipyard and get the vessel Vostok back in fighting shape. The command element, Bering's unit, departing later in August, this group moved light with horses, carrying only the absolute essentials. The rearguard Chirikov's unit. They stayed back in Yakutsk to survive the winter and move out the following spring with a fresh stockpile of supplies. The 700-mile stretch between Yakutsk and Okhotsk proved to be the most lethal and dehumanizing phase of the entire trek. For Spanberg's group, relying on boats loaded with 40 tons of gear turned out to be a massive strategic blunder against the Siberian geography. The rivers were shallow and jagged with rocks, forcing the men to jump into the freezing water to drag the barges against the current by hand. Progress was soul-crushingly slow. Some days they barely covered 1 single mile. When winter slammed into them in late 1726, the rivers turned to solid ice, trapping the fleet. The mission didn't stop, it just got worse. The cargo was moved to hand sleds, which the men had to haul through waist-deep snow. By December, the situation hit a breaking point. Starvation was so absolute that men were eating their own leather boots and drinking rancid fish oil, meant for machinery just to keep their hearts beating. Discipline was only maintained through sheer terror. Spanberg had to put troublemakers in irons and use the cat-o'-nine-tails to keep the work moving. In a final act of desperation to prevent a mutiny, Spanberg distributed his entire personal stash of flour and meat equally among the ranks, declaring they would all share the same misery. On January 6, 1727, they crawled into Okhotsk in a state of total collapse. Most were too sick to even stand. When Bering arrived on horseback 9 months later, he didn't find a shipyard. He found a graveyard of broken men. Okhotsk wasn't exactly a bustling port. It was a ghost town of 11 huts, inhabited by Russian families just barely scraping by on subsistence fishing. Bering was in a corner. With 0 supplies left, he was forced to seize the locals' flour just to keep his men alive, a move that basically signed a death warrant for the entire village. By June 1727, just as the locals were preparing for the end, Chirikov's unit finally rolled in. They brought 30 tons of flour from Yakutsk. narrowly saving both the expedition and the village from total annihilation. With the starvation crisis paused, the crew got to work. They patched up an old vessel called the Vostok and started building a second ship from scratch, the Fortuna, a 65-foot beast. But the resource shortage was so insane that they didn't even have basic hardware. Instead of iron nails, they had to lash the planks of the Fortuna together using willow branches and strips of raw leather. It wasn't just a ship, it was a floating miracle of desperate engineering. By the time the ships were sea-ready for the crossing to the Kamchatka Peninsula, the bill had come due. The human cost was staggering. 15 men were dead, and over 100 had deserted, vanishing into the wilderness with whatever horses and supplies they could steal. Reaching the west coast of Kamchatka at the Bolsheretsk settlement in 1727 was a relief. But the nightmare was far from over. Because they had zero intel on the treacherous waters around the peninsula, the expedition decided against sailing around Cape Lopatka. Instead, they chose to cut straight through the heart of the peninsula, a 600-mile trek over land and frozen rivers to reach the mouth of the Kamchatka River on the east coast. This stretch proved to be just as punishing as any part of the Siberian mainland. At this stage, European engineering was useless. Bering had to pivot and rely entirely on the technology and labour of the indigenous tribes. He hired hundreds of locals to transport the cargo using dog sleds, the only viable way to move through deep mountain snow where horses would simply starve or collapse. The logistics were a chaotic split. Part of the crew raced down the rivers before they turned to solid ice, while the rest pushed through blizzards and swampy graveyards that claimed the lives of both men and hundreds of horses. By the time they finally reached the Kamchatka River, they had paid in blood for every mile. But they were finally in position for the endgame, building the ship that would answer the ultimate question: was Russia actually connected to Alaska? Once the outpost was established, the mission shifted gears into full-blown shipbuilding mode. Unlike the barren landscape of Okhotsk, the Kamchatka River region actually provided what they desperately needed: forests with high-grade timber capable of handling the open sea. Construction kicked off on April 4th, 1728. The ship was a hybrid of local grit and imperial investment. While the hull was carved from Siberian wood, every single piece of ironwork, every foot of rigging, and every square inch of canvas had been hauled from St. Petersburg at a staggering human and financial cost. The result was the St. Gabriel, a rugged, single-masted vessel engineered to survive the violent temperament of what we now call the Bering Sea. By July 14th, the waiting was over. Bering weighed anchor and began the official reconnaissance voyage, pushing northeast along the Asian coastline into the deep unknown. Bering's methodology was precise: hug the coastline as tight as possible, keeping the land to his port side. Over the next month, the expedition systematically mapped the Russian coast, fixing the coordinates of islands that, until then, existed only as ghost stories and vague rumours. They checked off landmarks like the Gulf of Karachinski and Providence Bay, naming them as they went. On August 11th, 1728, the feast day of St. Lawrence, they spotted a massive island rising from the fog. Bering christened it St. Lawrence Island, a name that still sits on our maps today. As they cleared Cape Chukotsky and sailed into what we now call the Bering Strait, the St. Gabriel entered the Chukchi Sea. It was here that Bering noticed the coastline of Asia didn't just keep going north, it took a sharp, jagged turn to the west. On August 13th, Bering gathered his lieutenants on deck. They had hit a latitude of 67 degrees, 18 minutes north. Since the land was now stretching away to the west and there was zero sign of a land bridge to America, the mission's primary objective was officially locked in. Bering finally had his proof. The continents were separate. The New World wasn't an extension of the Old One. It was, in fact, an entirely different world. The visibility was so poor that even though they were only a few miles off the Alaskan coast, the American continent remained a ghost. The crew couldn't see a thing through the thick Arctic soup. fearing they'd be trapped in the ice as winter closed in, a death sentence without supplies. Bering made the call. On August 16, 1728, he ordered the St. Gabriel to turn south and run for it. After surviving brutal storms on the return trip, Bering dropped anchor back at the Kamchatka River on September 2nd. But he wasn't satisfied. The mission felt unfinished. In the summer of 1729, he launched a second attempt, this time betting everything on finding land to the east. Driven by the cartographic myths of the day, specifically the legendary Juan de Gama land, a phantom landmass people thought sat between Asia and America, Bering pushed the St. Gabriel about 150 miles into the open ocean. But the fog and the gales were relentless. At that latitude, Alaska was still over 800 miles away. They saw nothing but a grey, endless horizon. Even though he struck out on finding America during this second run, 1729 wasn't a total loss. Bering pulled off a major win by navigating around the southern tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula. This was a first for European sailors. By charting these unknown waters, he proved you could bypass that soul-crushing overland trek and reach Okhotsk by sea. This new route became the lifeline for every Russian outpost on the Pacific coast. Bering finally left the St. Gabriel docked in Okhotsk and began the long, dusty haul back to the capital, arriving on March 1st, 1730. He wasn't empty-handed. He brought back detailed logs, journals, and a map that would change everything. For the first time in history, the northeast coast of Asia was drawn to scale. It wasn't guesswork anymore. It was science. But the experts back at the Academy of Sciences and the Russian Admiralty weren't impressed. Despite the mountain of evidence, they hit Bering with a wave of skepticism. They pointed out that since he hadn't personally laid eyes on the American coast in 1728, he couldn't prove with absolute certainty that the continents didn't bridge together further north. It was a slap in the face, but that frustration became the political fuel Bering needed. This skepticism was the exact spark that ignited the green light for an even bigger, more ambitious sequel, the Great Northern Expedition. The second expedition kicked off just 3 years later, but this time it wasn't just a voyage. It was one of the most expensive and ambitious projects in the history of human exploration. We are talking about a mission that swallowed 1/6 of the Russian state's annual revenue. In today's money, that is roughly $800 million. The goal: map the North Pacific, find a sea route to Japan and China, and once and for all, plant a flag on the continent we now call Alaska. At the helm was Vitus Bering again. At nearly 52 years old, he was considered an old man by 18th century standards. While most of his peers were retiring to dry land, Bering was tasked with a mission that demanded years of extreme physical endurance and survival in conditions that would break most men half his age. To get 2 ships into the North Pacific, the expedition had to haul tons of iron for anchors and cannons, miles of rigging, and delicate scientific instruments across thousands of miles of roadless wilderness. This wasn't a small crew, it was a moving city of 3,000 people: sailors, blacksmiths, soldiers, and scientists. They pushed overland to Kazan, crossed the Ural Mountains, and dove deep into Siberia toward Tobolsk. From there, the rivers became their only highway. During the short Siberian summer, they used flat-bottom barges to crawl along the Irtysh, Ob, and Yenisei rivers. But that window was tight and treacherous. When the ice melted, the ground turned into an impassable swamp. The men were hit by swarms of mosquitoes, disease, and pure exhaustion in a landscape that flipped between bone-chilling ice and humid, suffocating heat. With no reliable supply chain, Bering was forced to stop at outposts like Yeniseisk and Irkutsk to demand food and livestock from local governors. More often than not, these officials would stall or sabotage the mission through sheer incompetence or corruption. Yakutsk became the mission's logistical heart for nearly 3 years. Bering had to coordinate moving massive loads from riverboats to horse caravans, and the terrain was a nightmare of deep swamps and jagged rock. Thousands of horses died just trying to fight the friction of the mud. For Bering, there was no turning back. If he quit in Yakutsk, he'd return to Russia as the man who burned through the national treasury for nothing. His only options were to march over a trail of horse carcasses or die trying. When he finally reached the Pacific, he didn't find a port. He found Okhotsk, a tiny fishing village with a few wooden shacks. There was no infrastructure, no tools, and no food for thousands of people. Almost every calorie had to be hauled thousands of miles. When the caravans were late, the men survived on rotten horse meat and roots. In the middle of this frozen void, Bering did the impossible. He turned a desolate outpost into an industrial shipyard. Men who arrived sick and starving were forced to forge anchors from damaged iron and shape holes in temperatures that plummeted to -40 degrees. Hundreds of men died before a single ship even touched the water. The exhaustion was so absolute that many simply lay down in the snow and never got back up. For 4 years, the expedition was stalled in Okhotsk, trapped in a cycle of logistical chaos, while Bering was forced to decide whether to use his remaining horses for hauling timber or for making soup. To the men in Okhotsk, Bering wasn't just a commander. He was a diplomat negotiating with death, trying to balance the birth of a fleet with the survival of his crew in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. After years of delays and survival mode construction in Okhotsk, 2 ships finally tasted salt water, the St. Peter and the St. Paul. These vessels were purpose-built tanks for the Arctic, roughly 80 feet long and 20 feet wide. Bering himself took command of the St. Peter with a crew of 77 men. The St. Paul was led by Alexei Chirikov, carrying a crew of 75. Every square inch of cargo space was crammed with dried meat and hardtack, that legendary flour biscuit with the texture and flavour of a bathroom tile. They also packed barrels of vodka, which wasn't for partying. It was the only social lubricant keeping 70-plus men from killing each other in those cramped quarters. Equipped with compasses and quadrants, they relied on stars that the North Pacific fog worked overtime to hide. On June 4th, both ships left Kamchatka, carrying the last gasp of the imperial budget, and a terrifying question: was Alaska actual land or just a cartographic fever dream? On June 20th, a massive storm tore the expedition in half. Visual contact was lost, and suddenly, they were 2 lonely missions in a vast grey void. By July, Chirikov's St. Paul hit the coast of Prince of Wales Island, and that is where the nightmare began. Chirikov sent his best longboat with 11 armed men to find water and scout the coast. They rowed into the bay and vanished into the tree line. Days passed. Silence. Desperate, Chirikov sent his second and final boat with 4 more men to find them. They never came back. For a week, the ship drifted in a terrifying silence. Chirikov could see nothing but the flicker of distant fires deep in the woods. On the 8th day, 2 vessels emerged from the mist. For a split second, the crew felt a surge of relief. They thought their boys were coming home. But as they got closer, their blood turned to ice. These weren't Russian boats. They were Tlingit canoes. One of the natives stood up, wearing clothes that looked hauntingly familiar. They belonged to one of the missing sailors. They shouted something into the wind, and before the Russians could even process the horror, they paddled back into the shadows of the forest. The St. Paul was now a ghost ship. With no boats left, Chirikov couldn't land to fight, rescue his men, or even refill the water casks that were bone dry. As scurvy ravaged the crew, he was forced to make the darkest call of the entire voyage: abandon the 15 men to their fate. If they were even still alive, they were never seen again. While Chirikov fled to save what was left of his crew, Bering's St. Peter was facing its own collapse. In September, they hit the Shumagin Islands, where the naturalist Georg Steller began documenting creatures that science didn't even have names for yet. Alaska had a biological welcoming committee that had no idea the Russians weren't there to make friends. First up was Steller's sea cow. Picture a 30-foot-long, 10-ton manatee that had zero fear of humans and spent its days munching kelp. For the sailors, it was a floating, self-service butcher shop. Its meat was described as better than beef, and the fat lasted for months. We managed to hunt it into extinction just 27 years after finding it. That's a world record for destroying a species before we even finished drawing it on the map. But the real biological gold was the sea otter. With 150,000 hairs per square centimetre, they have the densest fur on the planet, a masterpiece of thermal armour. In the Russian Empire, a single pelt was worth more than a soldier's yearly salary. It didn't take long for that discovery to turn into a blood-soaked gold mine. Despite being surrounded by all that biological wealth, the men were rotting. Scurvy was winning. Simple tasks now required a group effort. Chirikov's St. Paul managed to limp back to Avacha Bay by October, carrying maps and confirmation of the Alaskan coast. But the St. Peter wouldn't be so lucky. In November 1741, storms slammed the vessel. The crew was too weak to fight the wheel. On the 12th, the ship was hurled against the reefs of what we now call Bering Island. The survivors were trapped in a frozen void, hundreds of miles from help, with the Arctic winter knocking on the door. Leadership shattered when Vitus Bering finally died, consumed by disease and the cold. He was buried right there, in a sand pit on the island that would carry his name forever. Without a ship or a leader, the survivors had to dismantle the wreck of the St. Peter and build a smaller boat, piece by piece, from the scraps. Working at the literal edge of sanity, they managed to launch their makeshift craft in August 1742. Only 46 of the original 77 men were left. When they finally reached Petropavlovsk, people looked at them like they were seeing ghosts. The cost was astronomical. Half the sea crew was dead, a number that doesn't even count the hundreds lost during the years of land hauling and construction. But the legacy was monumental. Bering proved Alaska was a continent, allowing Russia to claim it all. No other mission in history had ever tried to map so much territory in one go. Russia founded outposts in Kodiak and Sitka, turning the fur trade into an empire. But history has a dark sense of humour. A century later, in 1867, all that territory, conquered with blood, sweat, and frozen lives, was sold to the Americans for a measly $7.2 million. Bering mapped the future and proved that a new world existed, but he did not live to see that his ultimate sacrifice would become perhaps the greatest real estate blunder in human history.